We actually have a treat. We have a trio of speakers who are coming on stage in a second. A member of the Nanticoke Indian tribe, Courtney Streett, co-founded the Native Roots Farm Foundation, co-leads the East Coast Seedkeepers, creating oral history, archival research, and genetic analysis to reclaim ancestral seeds. Before this, she was a television producer at CBS and Business Insider, so she knows how to tell a story. Joining her in person is Hannah Goins, a member of the Lumbee Nation, a tribal lawyer whose work advances Indigenous people's rights and ensures that free, prior, and informed consent is upheld in any engagement with tribal nations. And then also in this session, we have a virtual speaker joining us, who's Desmond Boykin. So today's story is one that matters. Please welcome Courtney, Hannah, and Desmond.
Hi everyone, it's great to be with you. Closer? Hi, it's good to be with you all this afternoon. Want to say a quick wanishi to Crystal. Thank you for the warm introduction. Wanishi to Larry. Thank you for inviting us to share our stories and our work with this community. And a wanishi also to my in-laws, Mary and Al Reynolds, who are part of the GoldLab community and have made this opportunity possible. We are going to do a quick introduction of each of us and a quick overview of our talk today, and then we will jump into the conversation. So I'm Courtney Streett. I'm a member of the Nanticoke tribe, which is based in Delaware. And I also co-founded and am the president and executive director of Native Roots Farm Foundation.
Hello. My name is Hannah Goins. I'm a member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. I'm an attorney, so I did not get much of today's presentations, but I'm fascinated to be here and excited to be a part of East Coast Seedkeepers.
Desmond?
Hi, can everyone hear me? Am I good? Okay. My name is Desmond Boykin. I'm from the Nanticoke tribe, and I study evolutionary biology at Princeton University.
And we are but a few members of the East Coast Seedkeepers, and we'll spend this session centering Indigenous ecological knowledge and an Indigenous worldview. We will highlight our work with the East Coast Seedkeepers and the impacts that we're making in our communities. And we will also share how we're bridging Western and Indigenous science to restore Indigenous sovereignty.
All right, where's the clicker? Okay, I'm going to talk at y'all a little bit. We're going to do a little bit of Sovereignty 101 to just preface why this group came together, why it matters. And I want to talk a little bit about Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land. Can you hear me? Is this better? Y'all let me know. Let me know if you can't hear me. So when we talk about Indigenous peoples as original stewards, sometimes it gets diluted into vague environmental language that doesn't really explain what stewardship looked like in practice. Indigenous peoples did not simply live passively within these environments. Our communities shaped them. Forests, river systems, grasslands, wetlands, coastal areas, and agricultural fields were maintained through systems of observation, harvesting, burning, planting, pruning, fishing, seed selection, seasonal movement, and governance developed over generations of direct relationship with specific places. A lot of the ecosystems later described as untouched wilderness were actually deeply managed landscapes. Across different Indigenous communities, peoples used controlled burning to maintain forests, encourage certain plant species, improve hunting conditions, and support ecological balance. River systems and fisheries were stewarded through harvesting practices tied to seasonal cycles. And agricultural systems involve selective breeding, companion planting, soil management, and long-term seed adaptation to local conditions. Stewardship was also not separate from governance. Indigenous ecological systems were tied to law, responsibility, kinship, and collective accountability. There were expectations around how land and resources were treated because people understood themselves as existing within those systems, not outside of them. That's part of why the wilderness narrative can be so damaging. The idea of wilderness did not emerge as a neutral description of land. It was developed through colonial ways of thinking that treated land as valuable only if it was visibly settled, enclosed, farmed according to European agricultural systems, or governed through European political structures. So when colonizers encountered indigenous managed landscapes, they often interpreted them as empty or wild because indigenous stewardship did not always resemble European values. Once indigenous management was erased from the story, land could be reframed as unoccupied or unused, helping justify seizure, settlement, extraction, and removal. In the United States, ideas like manifest destiny built on that logic. Civilized land became defined according to European expectations, while indigenous managed landscapes were recast as naturally existing wilderness instead of the result of ongoing stewardship. You still see traces of that thinking now. Indigenous nations are often treated like outside voices in conservation efforts and conversations about lands that we've maintained relationships with since time immemorial. At the same time, Western ecological science is increasingly recognizing ideas about indigenous communities and how we have long understood our relationship with the land. Ecosystems depend on reciprocity, interdependence, adaptation, and long-term balance.
And in indigenous communities right here and around the world, we have always been connected with the natural world. And humans and nature are intertwined. In indigenous communities, the natural world around us is alive, from the stars in the sky to the boulders just outside these windows, to this building, the juniper that's growing outside the building, and the Colorado River. And as living beings, they all have personhood. So I like to say plants are people too, because I'm a plant nerd. Indigenous people have what Robin Wall Kimmerer calls a reciprocal relationship with plants. We nurture plants, and plants nurture us. So we hold seeds tight until the conditions are right to plant them. And when we do, we make sure that they have access to light and to water so that they can germinate. And then as they grow, we make sure that they have nutrients and fertilizer. When they form fruits, we want to keep the pests away, but also share. We practice what Robin Wall Kimmerer calls the honorable harvest. We ask permission before we harvest anything at all. We take only what we need, and then we give thanks for what we have taken because it is a gift. And then we savor those fruits. We save their seeds for us, for future growing seasons, and for future generations of those plants. Plants recognize this. We nurture them, and they nurture us. They provide us with nutritious and delicious foods, and they also pass down stories, generations of stories and legacy, and also tie us to place.
So I just wanted to give you a statistic to kind of validate some of the things we're saying. Today Indigenous people stored 22% of the land worldwide, which protects 80% of the planet's biodiversity. So I think that kind of speaks for itself. I'll talk to you a little bit about our collaborative, our group, East Coast Seedkeepers. We grew out of relationships between Indigenous farmers, seed keepers, researchers, and community members who were already doing this work within their own communities and wanted to reconnect those efforts across the region. At the center are New Ground Farm and Lumbee Homelands in North Carolina, and Native Roots Farm Foundation and Nanticoke Homelands in Delaware, along with a broader network of Indigenous growers and collaborators working to strengthen Indigenous food systems through seed keeping, research, education, and community access. The collaboration is grounded in the understanding that Indigenous food systems were never isolated from each other. Seeds, agricultural knowledge, trade relationships, and growing practices moved across Indigenous communities long before state lines existed. Colonization disrupted many of those systems through displacement, land loss, forced assimilation, and industrial agriculture. but many of the seeds and practices and relationships remained. A major part of the work focuses on keeping ancestral seeds in active use. These seeds are being grown out under current conditions, observed across different soils and climates, and saved season after season, and reintroduced into community food systems through workshops, seed exchanges, educational programming, and local distribution networks. There's also a significant research component to the work. It includes documenting oral histories connected to specific crops and growing practices, tracing regional seed histories, studying land race genetics, and observing how certain varieties adapt across different environments in the Southeast and larger East Coast. Some of the work looks at traits like drought tolerance, flood resilience, productivity under local growing conditions, flavor, importantly, storage capacity, and cultural use. The research also helps identify connections between varieties that have traveled through historic indigenous trades and kinship networks. And at the same time, the research is not being treated as separate from community use. The purpose is not to extract this information. It's to place seeds, or not to place seeds in purely academic collection. It's meant to support Indigenous farmers and growers who are actively farming and strengthening knowledge sharing between communities to help ensure that these crops remain part of living Indigenous food systems rather than disconnected historical artifacts.
We're just going to move through these quickly. And so these are our partners. We're working with Princeton University, Emory College at Emory University, New Ground Farm, the Seed Farm at Princeton, and Native Roots Farm Foundation.
And here are just a few of the things that East Coast Seedkeepers does. You can see, I'm going to try to use this laser. This is Mr. Millard and Connie Locklear. They're from New Ground Farms. They're the Lumbee side of East Coast Seedkeepers. Here's them just talking to us, but per usual, doing this multi-generational teaching and cultural reconnection. So much of the work we do is storytelling and understanding how these seeds and crops were used historically and how we can reincorporate them into our diet and just larger cultural use. Then, to achieve this goal, we want to develop and document seed recovery and stewardship protocols. We want to try to teach Indigenous growing practices and values within our communities, so it's not just our elders that have this knowledge. We want to pass it down generationally. We want to distribute these plants between our own communities and hopefully other Indigenous communities. And we want to provide a model for folks to be able to follow, hopefully. We don't want this to just be a thing within our own communities. We want other tribal nations to see this kind of work and understand, we can work collaboratively and still have our own goals. So I'll talk a little bit about New Ground Farm, being that I'm the Lumbee side of things today. So the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, we are the 9th largest tribe in the United States. We are the most recently federally recognized tribe in December of 2025. There are 575 federally recognized tribes in the country. There are over 400 state and non-recognized tribes in the country. So when we think about tribes, we think about them as governments, as nations, with their own agendas, capacity, and goals to achieve. But there are some similarities, and we try to find that within our group. So New Ground Farm is a Lumbee family farm in Robeson County, North Carolina, operated by Mr. Millard Locklear, Miss Connie Locklear. The land itself has remained in Mr. Millard's family for 5 generations, which is significant in a region where many Indigenous families have lost land through displacement, discriminatory lending, developmental pressure, and the broader economic realities facing small farmers across the South and across the country. The farm, as it operates today, grew out of decades of part-time farming before Mr. Millard retired and transitioned into full-time production in 2015. A lot of the knowledge shaping the farm came through family practices, observation, community, relationships, and trial and error. The farm grows a mix of commercial crops and culturally important foods at the same time. That balance is intentional and reflects the reality that many Indigenous farmers navigate. They still have to make a profit. They still have to do commercial farming and grow the crops that they know will sell well, but they also are interested in this kind of research component where they are testing growing conditions for what we understand to be ancestral seeds within our own community. So I look at it as kind of their experimental patch of the farm is where we get to do the research that we're actually interested in, and then most of the farm goes towards the commercial crops. Miss Connie's work as an herbalist is also deeply connected to the farm. The knowledge she carries shapes how the farm approaches plants as medicine and food and wellness as interconnected rather than separate categories. That relationship shows up not only in what is grown, but in how knowledge is shared through conversations and remedies, food preparation, and community relationships. The farm operates with an understanding that health is tied to land, and access to culturally meaningful foods and intergenerational knowledge will help re-indigenize the food systems. And yeah, that's New Ground Farm.
And what we now call Delaware, where Desmond and I are from, recognizes two Indigenous communities, the Lenape tribe of Delaware and the Nanticoke tribe. And Desmond and I are members of the Nanticoke tribe. And the word Nanticoke is pretty illustrative. It means the tidewater people, because we are literally from between the tidewaters, between the Delaware Bay to the east and the Chesapeake Bay to the west. So that's the area that we now call the Delmarva Peninsula, the eastern shore of Maryland, the state of Delaware. That's where we are from. And in 1620, the Mayflower arrived on the shores of Cape Cod, what we now call Cape Cod. And that's what most people think of when they think of colonizers coming to the Americas, is the first boat's the Mayflower. In 1608, the Nanticoke people encountered Europeans for the first time, and they were led by a guy named John Smith, who you've probably seen in the movie Pocahontas. And with these newcomers came colonization and forced assimilation and reservations on the East Coast. The first reservations were in the 1600s in Maryland. This photo is a former Nanticoke reservation, which became a plantation and now is a living history museum. And by these forced removals, by forced assimilation, by prohibiting access to food, to gathering, to our traditional practices and hunting and fishing, the culture, the language, the stories, the traditions that we had were slowly chipped away over 400 years of colonization. Members of the Nanticoke tribe survived by hiding in plain sight. They blended into mainstream culture in what is now Millsboro, Delaware, and became farmers, multi-generational farmers. And that's where our tribe is still based today, and that's now one of the fastest developing regions of our country. And I consider this to be a second wave of colonization, because as farms are being sold off and trees are being ripped from the soil, and housing developments and strip malls are going in, our community is yet again at risk of being disconnected from the natural world. And so in 2020, from our Brooklyn kitchen table, my partner John and I co-founded Native Roots Farm Foundation, which we call NRFF for short because Native Roots Farm Foundation is a tongue twister. And this is our mission. We are reclaiming, cultivating, and celebrating Native relationships with land, plants, and community for the next 7 generations. And about 6 weeks ago, we closed on a 50-acre property where we are creating a public hakihakan, which is the Lenape word for a garden or a farm. And on that space, we will be growing native plants and identifying them in Indigenous languages and sharing the relationships that our ancestors had and that we continue to have with these plants, as food, as medicines, as textiles, as dyes, you name it. And in the meantime, since 2020, we've engaged over 400,000 people through hands-on and social media programming, all of which uplift Indigenous ecological knowledge. We have art-based programs, food-based programs, and horticultural-based programs. And I say that there are 3 different focuses, but they are 3 different strands that come together to form a braid of cultural revitalization. And at the heart of our work is our Three Sisters Garden. And there we bring together members of our local Nanticoke and Lenape communities to reconnect with culturally meaningful Lenape and Nanticoke varieties of corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters. Are any of you familiar with this? A few people. Okay, great. So this is an Indigenous land stewardship practice in which corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, grow together. So corn is the first sister to be planted, and she grows tall, and she anchors her roots to the soil. And beans is the second sister planted, and she trellises up corn stalk, and her roots fix nitrogen in the soil, making that nutrient available to her sisters. And the third sister is squash, and she grows wide across the soil, and she has enormous, enormous leaves. And those leaves prevent sunlight from reaching the soil, which helps trap moisture and make sure that the roots of her sisters have water. And it also suppresses weeds and keeps them really prickly, and so it keeps pests away from the garden. And the Three Sisters Garden is a living classroom where plants and people come together to learn and to grow during weekly work days and intertribal gatherings. And the garden is the first time that these plants have been planted in their ancestral soils. These plants and their human kin have been in relationship, and these plants have been in relationship with each other for the first time in decades, if not generations. And Desmond, we're going to toss it to you now.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Good?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Desmond. So I wanted to start off, I am conducting the research for the East Coast Seedkeepers for the rematriation project. And I wanted to start off with an example of mutualisms, which Courtney was explaining with the three sisters. So previously there was this notion in evolutionary biology or a misunderstanding of survival of the fittest, where there was a Darwinian concept that you have to be the strongest or the fastest within a group to pass on your genes or to maintain fitness. However, as science is advancing and evolutionary biology is advancing, we're coming to understand that it's more akin to survival of the good enough, and that there are a ton of altruistic behaviors in nature and mutualisms all around us, just as is seen in many indigenous outlooks on the world. And some prominent examples are mycelial networks, or older mother trees, where these fungal networks underground will share resources with one another and with the other plants and trees throughout the forest. And older, more established mother trees that have nutrients to spare will give these nutrients to other trees in the area via these mycelial networks that are in need. So we see a lot of reciprocity within nature. And that ties into this Three Sisters farming method. Next slide, please. So the main problem, and the reason this research is being conducted, is that there is a lack of genetic diversity in modern maize throughout North and South America. And this poses a problem because if we are trying to rematriate a specific variety of maize, both the Lumbee Lovett corn and the Lenape blue sweet corn, the sample size in which we originally had these seeds is so small. So if we continue to grow these seeds and crossbreed them, we're going to see a large amount of inbreeding within the population, and that obviously will lead to the accumulation of deleterious alleles within the population. So I wanted to check taking 50 individuals of the Lumbee Lovett seeds and 50 individuals of the Lenape blue sweet corn seeds to first check the genetic diversity as well as where they fit in the phylogenetic tree. But before I explain the research, I wanted to go into the domestication of maize and how we got to this bottlenecking event. So modern maize, or what we call corn, came from teosinte, which is this very small grain that you see in the top right corner. And it was domesticated by indigenous peoples in the Balsas River Valley of Mexico roughly 9,000 years ago. And these indigenous farmers selected for really specific traits because teosinte, which is still grows today, contains kernels that are extremely hard that you have to crack open to get the grain out so you can eat. So selection was done both on the architecture, such as the stability, larger kernel size, cooking ability, growing ability, and certain traits such as drought tolerance. However, when we selected for these traits, we also lost traits that weren't visible to the eye. Next slide, please. So this loss of genetic diversity was due to bottlenecking events, and recent studies regarding teosinte versus modern industrial maize, such as sweet corn, has shown that there is an approximate 18 to 20% loss in genetic diversity when you compare modern maize to the parviglumis variety of teosinte. And a lot of this diversity also has to do with nutritional value, as it's around the same number. Many indigenous varieties of maize and teosinte contain about 20% more nutritional protein than modern industrial maize, which is extremely carb heavy. Next slide, please. And this genetic diversity is directly linked to geography. Similar to human genetic diversity, I couldn't find a map regarding specifically maize genetic diversity, as it's very niche. However, with humans, there's the most genetic diversity within Africa, and as you move away from Africa, the genetic diversity decreases because humans have been in Africa for the longest amount of time. The same can be said in regard to maize, as maize originated in the Balsas River Valley of Mexico. And when one travels north or south, especially to the Andes or the East Coast of North America, the genetic diversity plummets. And this is because within Central America, teosinte varieties still exist. So there's a lot of cross-pollination and cross-breeding with modern teosinte and modern agricultural crops. And these bottleneck events mainly occurred pre and post-colonization, mainly through the migration of humans. As humans carried seeds, or they would go places, they would trade, and you only take a subset, the population of seeds that you have, and you give it to the next person and they plant them, and then you choose a specific subset of seeds and it continues. So in the past, there was an amalgam of phenotypic diversity, genotypic diversity, as you can see in the bottlenecking diagram. And then we come to today where we have only the genetic representation of a really small portion of what used to be an extremely large population. And it's this large representation that helps combat against disease or other deleterious alleles that add up in the population. Next slide, please. So I believe these studies are extremely recent, I would say around 2024 to 2025. This study was looking at teosinte introgression and what alleles were lost during the domestication of maize, comparing it to B73 variety of modern maize. And what occurred was trait decoupling. So trait decoupling is when the people who domesticated maize, or whenever someone plants maize, you pick whichever variety or individual looks the best for the purpose that you need. However, there are many genes that aren't physical or visible to the eye that are still extremely important, such as disease resistance or drought tolerance. You can't see that when you select for it. And as domestication occurred, these traits were decoupled or lost within the population, and we didn't even know they existed in the first place until recently. And some examples of these genes that are still found in teosinte but are lost in agricultural maize is nitrogen efficiency. If any of you are farmers or have grown maize, you would know corn requires a lot of nitrogen to grow and a lot of fertilizer if you don't use the Three Sisters method. And that's because it lost THP9, which I believe is in a future slide. Because teosinte stores nitrogen in the form of asparagine, which can easily travel throughout the plant. Modern agricultural maize is not able to convert nitrogen into asparagine. Another really important trait that was lost is drought tolerance, because there are about 8 varieties of teosinte, I'd say, and drought tolerance and UV protection as well were extremely important in the varieties of maize that were high in the highlands away from tropical regions. And UV protection as well. The pigmentation, the variety of colors you see in maize, that pigmentation arose as a way to combat UV radiation in such a high level, as well as disease resistance, which is directly correlated to the height of the kernel or the cob on the plant. So the higher the cob is on the plant, the further a disease has to travel, and the likelihood that the kernel gets infected decreases the higher it is on the plant. So all of these traits were decoupled or lost once we domesticated the modern agricultural maize. Next slide, please. So once those genes were established, and once scientists found out, or genomicists found out, that there is a large decrease in genetic diversity when you compare to the ancestral variety of maize, it's possible to introgress specific genes that we're looking for so we can reap the benefits of those genes. And this can either be done through genome splicing and editing it into the genome, or it can be done, this has been successfully done, F6 breeding, where you take one individual of teosinte and one of whichever maize you're growing, have them mate, and then continue mating the offspring until you get 6 generations down. And you end up with an individual who phenotypically resembles the crop you're targeting or want it to look like, but genetically it has accumulated the genetic variation of the teosinte. And sometimes you'll acquire the beneficial traits. And some specific traits that I will be looking for in this study include UPA2, THP9, and certain ethylene transcription factors. So UPA2, which means upright angle 2, is a gene that has to do with narrow leaf angles in teosinte, which also works in maize. And this is beneficial because the more upright an angle is, I don't know if everyone can see me, the more narrow a leaf angle is, the closer you can plant individuals next to each other. And teosinte has evolved such that the angle is just open enough that it can still acquire sunlight without competing against the other individuals. And THP9 is teosinte high protein 9, which is the gene involved in promoting nitrogen conversion into asparagine. So that's also extremely important. Both of these would make the planting process much easier and help the plants grow to the best of their ability. There are also certain ethylene transcription factors that were found in the study that can be introgressed into the genome that directly correlate to how high the ear insertion is on the kernel so that you can combat against disease resistance. Next slide, please. So my plan for this study while working with NRFF over the summer is to grow in the Three Sisters mound method with a control on the squash and the beans, to grow 50 individuals of Lumbee lovett corn from the Lumbee community and 50 individuals of the Lenape blue sweet corn from the Lenape diaspora, and take leaf tissue samples once they reach maturity. And each of the 100 samples total will be sequenced with the S&P 50 Illumina maize bead chip, built specifically for these genomic, like GWAS studies for maize diversity. In fact, a lot of the teosinte research was conducted on the S&P 50 chip. So once these genomes are sequenced, they'll be processed through Plink, genetic distance matrix can be made, and then multiple phylogenetic trees will be created, but the most parsimonious one will be the one that we go with to see where both the Lumbee and the Lenape varieties of maize fit into a phylogenetic tree throughout evolutionary history. And one, this can help us see how is it related to other individuals, maybe where did it go geographically during migrations, but also it can help us see if a related variety has certain attributes such as nutritional benefits or architectural benefits such as height. If it's closely related, then we can make inferences on our variety of maize or the Lumbee variety of maize based on how closely related it is to other individuals. Next slide, please. And then the main importance of this study will be a GWAS, genome-wide association study, along with genetic diversity analysis such as FST, FIS, or nucleotide diversity. And the genome-wide association study will be important, one, to detect the genetic diversity within the population, but also to see how similar and how different the Lumbee and Lenape varieties are to one another in regard to specific alleles such as the THP or the UPA2, and also if these genes are present or absent in general. They may have been lost or decoupled within the population, but maybe they're still there. We currently don't know if they're within the genome or not. And if they are within the genome, then the next steps after this will be to likely do single-cell RNA-seq once they produce kernels to see, are these genes active or are they dormant and just laying in the genome? Next slide, please. And once the nucleotide diversity or the heterozygosity within both of the populations is determined, then we can make a tailored agricultural plan specifically for the Lenape variety and the Lumbee variety to see how quickly, how much time or how many generations do we have before the populations become too inbred, and how important is it to introduce more genetic variation into the population, and how should we go about that? Should we cross it with Lumbee varieties and Lenape, or should we introgress some Teosinte varieties within the population? Courtney, I'll give it to you.
We'll also be serving as a reference for other Indigenous communities who are doing this rematriation and cultural restoration work, and ultimately reuniting our plant and human communities, revealing the nutritional values of ancestral plants, and re-indigenizing our food systems. Wanishi, thank you.
I guess this is Q&A now.
So we have a few minutes for questions, and it turns out that our next speaker just stepped out of the room, so we need to fill a little bit of time.
Also, Desmond says he likes Q&A, so make sure you ask him questions. Thank you.
Yes. So I'm going to rely on our two individuals with headsets to point at people, and then we'll go for time. Talon?
Hey, all right, wait, check. All right, there we go. Thank you. Lovely presentation. Thank you for your work. I just had a quick comment and then a question. The comment is for examples of indigenous alterations of land, so they're not, just wild type. Look into the clam gardens up in British Columbia. They basically rolled a bunch of boulders off the side, and then you have more land to get clams from. So it's a great example of that. And then secondarily, I was curious, what you're talking about here more or less equates to food sovereignty and the control of foodstuffs and our ability to feed and foster health within our communities. Do you have anything to comment on when it comes to things like patenting of indigenous foodstuffs like taro or wild rice or, that one cultivar of corn, the one? And thank you, that's it.
Well, I would say a lot of our work, a lot of the research also that Desmond is working on, and Desmond can speak to this better, there are a lot of ethics involved in this. And we are asking a lot of hard questions of ourselves and asking how deeply do we want to probe into doing this science, because plants are people too. Would we do this to our relatives? Would we do this to our cousins? And you were talking about land management systems. We have controlled burns across the U.S. by indigenous communities. If you look at buffalo across the plains, that they are land, sustainability and sovereignty in terms of those animals.
I'd also say the next presenter is going to speak much more to the data sovereignty piece, and I'm excited to hear about that. But right now, we're not in a space to share the results of anything past kind of preliminary conversations like these, and we will be very cognizant of data sovereignty protocols and how to keep that information within the community, because that's who it's for. You know, it's interesting to come and share with y'all and to make sure you understand that tribes are nations and to be worked with as nations, but ultimately this is for our Indigenous communities, so we definitely will be very cognizant of data sovereignty. That's the legal piece of things.
We actually have Lex next.
Really enjoyed the presentation. A question with regards to indigenous populations in other territories. I interact with people out of Venezuela, Colombia, that are now facing, for the last 50 years, what you have faced for 400 years. Communicating with each other and thereby guiding each other, I think can be enormously important for both groups. I have good contacts in Boston that are there. If you're interested, happy to place you in contact. For me, what I learned from them was inspiring, and what they're losing is terrible, and hence you might be able to join force.
Wanishi, thank you. Desmond, sorry, did you have anything to add to that first question?
No, you said it
cool.
perfectly.
Thank you.
I have a question for, probably for Desmond. I want maybe to hear your thoughts on the impact of global warming. And I use that term and not the word climate change, because if you don't know, in 2002, a GOP strategist named Frank Luntz convinced people in that party to use the term climate change rather than global warming. He also encouraged them to use the term government takeover rather than healthcare reform. But so I like to use global warming. And so my question is, what I'm hearing from the scientific community that believes in global warming is this sort of growing din for genetic modification of plants, you know, for individual survival traits, rather than things like reinstituting mutualism and reintroducing genetic diversity. It sounds like to me that a genetically bottlenecked food supply where rice, beans, and corn feed 90% of the world, all three of those are genetically bottlenecked, as I understand. And not doing these sorts of things, and rather, just trying to genetically modify for individual traits could potentially be disastrous, but you're more of an expert than me.
I definitely agree. In regard to global warming specifically, the more industrial maize is definitely bottlenecked. It's all homogenized. But for a plant perspective, there definitely is a better chance of survival and health for food systems if we promote that genetic diversity, because the climate could go in many different ways. So the more genetic diversity that these plants have, there's a better percentage that a good chunk will survive throughout that time.
I'd like to ask you. We can hear you. Easier said than done. I'd like to ask you.
Desmond, can you hear?
To address the question of scale. In other words, what works for small localized locations and populations, how are we going to address feeding 8 billion people with the multiple challenges, not just global warming, but drought and poisoning of our water table, et cetera, et cetera. So how is this going to scale?
The question is, how is this going to scale? How do we take these small gardens, farms, networks, and scale it to feed 8 billion people? Desmond, do you want to answer that one?
I have a little to add to it.
Thanks.
So the Three Sisters method is definitely easier at a smaller scale, simply because you have to make mounds, and it's easier for machines to collect the crops when they're in perfect rows, just machine-wise. But the teosinte genes are still beneficial even if you apply it to a modern agricultural setting, such as the UPA2 gene, where the leaves are more upright because you're promoting more sun acquisition while also enabling the plants to be closer to one another, which still works in both agricultural settings.
And I'd also add that when the three sisters grow together, they produce more food acre per acre than when they're grown individually. So the mutualism and their relationship, that kinship, is intricately linked to the ability to feed vast populations.
I would also say, back to the food sovereignty question, it's not our goal to feed the world. It's to re-indigenize our own communities and let other folks use this model for their communities, as we all have different goals and priorities.
Short, Larry.
I promise. So many of us came through the Denver airport, where there's a restaurant called Tosanabe, which serves native foods. And you've got an opportunity here in front of an audience that descended largely from colonizers to try and help us decolonize a little bit. And so I wondered if you could talk about how food is a way of enacting decolonization, and if that's at all on your agendas.
I mean, food is medicine. Food is often the source of many memories for folks. I would say I can't speak to, how to decolonize through food at a large scale, but I do think, back to the scale question, there's opportunities for communities to join in to better understand, like when we talk about land acknowledgements and understanding the communities that were here prior to, part of that understanding is the foods that sustain them, pushing back on some of the narratives around Thanksgiving, like when Native people just fed, colonizers and were really nice about it. And no, we kept you alive, unfortunately, in some senses. So I think, it's a part of like learning the community you're in is a good start, learning, the tribes that are around and what they're comfortable sharing with you. I think the next presenter will speak more to the data sovereignty things, but it varies.
Well, thank you so much. Please give them a round of applause.